Hello and welcome to Good Grief. 1 in 29 British school children are bereaved of a parent or sibling by the time they leave school, an equivalent of one child in every class. However, there is no requirement for schools anywhere in the UK to cover grief or bereavement. In today's panel, we'll be exploring how grief education in schools could help children understand grief, support others, and foster the development of a more compassionate society. I'm Lesel Dawson, and I'm delighted to be joined on Good Grief by my three guests. Michael Rosen is a best-selling author, poet, presenter, and political columnist. He has written over 100 books, including the iconic We're Going on a Bear Hunt, the beautiful sad book written after his son Eddie died in 1999, and his fantastic recent memoir, Getting Better, which explores the power of stories to help us understand and talk about our feelings and experiences. Tracey Boseley is Child Bereavement UK's Head of Education Sector Support. She has delivered bereavement training to thousands of education professionals. She is also the co-author of the article and policy report that accompanies this panel, which was also written by Alison Penny from Childhood Bereavement Network, John Adams, President of the National Association of Funeral Directors, and Rachel Hare, Lucy Selman, and me from the University of Bristol. Finally, Jess Bacon is a journalist and writer who has spoken openly about grief, mental health, and her experience of the death of her dad when she was 16. As with other panels, this show will be recorded and it will be made available on our YouTube channel, The Grief Channel, after this. Please feel free, as you have done, to use the chat box to say hello, to respond to one another. And we've had some questions come in advance of tonight, and you can also put some questions down via the Q&A function below. So without further ado, hello, Michael, Tracey, and Jess. Welcome to Good Grief. It's great to have you here. I thought I'd kick off our discussion today with Michael. Can I ask you, in your years of working with children, what have you learned about speaking to kids about death and grief?
I think the most important thing I learned was actually not talking directly about what happened to me, because I'm on the sort of other side of the fence, really, because I lost a child rather than being a child who lost a parent or somebody else. It was reading a poem, and I do this sometimes. It's a poem in my book, Quick, Let's Get Out of Here, when I was sitting with my dad. My mum wasn't in the room. We were going through the old photographs, and I pulled out a photograph and asked my dad, who's in the picture, because there was a picture of my mum with a baby on her lap. And I said, is that me or Brian? That's my older brother, Brian, you see. And my dad looked at it. I was about 11. My brother would have been about 15. And my dad looked at it and he said, well, that's neither of you. That's Alan. He died. And this was the first that I'd ever heard that there was a baby who had died, a baby before me, between me and my brother, you see. So I was born 46, my brother 42, so this is a baby who died in 44. And I can remember the feeling of almost shame that I'd broached this matter. It was as if it was somehow my fault. And I've written that in the poem. And then I said, well, what did he die of? And my dad said, whooping cough. He died, he coughed himself to death in Connie, that's my mum, in Connie's arms, so they didn't have the medicines at the time. And then what's then quite strange, and what again I write about, is that my mum never ever mentioned it, ever, for the rest of her life. There were no photographs, there were no memorials anywhere, there was no grave. And though my dad did mention it, and of course we did talk a bit about it when Eddie died, that we were somehow or other both in the same place. So I talk about this with children because it's about silence and discovery and whatever that means. And also I've discovered that if I read the poem and the group is small enough, then it's almost as if people just immediately start talking. It is very strange. I never predicted this, but that if I just read it, get to the end, and I don't really have to say anything, people just sit for a bit, and then someone will start saying things, and it might be about pets, or it might be about grannies and granddads, or it might be about something else awful that happened. It might so it becomes a kind of nodal point, a growth point for talk. And I've found very incredibly moving discussions and people treating each other very respectfully in situations that maybe it might have been difficult for them to do so. I can think of one occasion when there were like year 7s bunged in with year 10s and 9s in quite a difficult situation. And they were all incredibly respectful towards each other. And I did have the feeling that somehow or other, because a poem was there in front of us, you could sort of like, like a plate of food, that it enabled people to sort of reach forward and sort of treat it like finger food and go into it and take it. So that in some ways has been better than rather me talking about Eddie, because that seems to somehow or other be the kind of wrong angle, unless people ask me, unless people say, and of course I will always say that, and sometimes they will, particularly about the sad book, and particularly about that very first picture in the sad book.
Lots of people in the chat are commenting how much they love the sad book, by the way.
That one there, so which says, this is me being sad and there's me grinning, as you can see. So sometimes that's been a similar nodal point, but again, it is slightly the wrong side of the fence for today's chat.
No, but I think what you're saying is really important, because having a book, a poem, you're not saying to children, what is your grief experience? You're offering a story, something else for them to pick up, and they have a choice as to whether they engage with the poem, where they share stories. It's quite a safe environment to do that. So I think as we move on to talk about ways of introducing grief education, I think that offers a kind of model for one of the ways in to talking about difficult subjects that feels safe. Can I ask, why do you think it's important, Michael, to talk to kids about grief and death and things like this?
Well, one very obvious reason is that it is part of life. We have this continuum of birth and reproduction and living and growing older and dying. And rather mysteriously, in modern life, we have tended to chop off this last bit. I mean, in traditional cultures, we know there's all sorts of religious frameworks for it. If you just think of the cycle of marriages and deaths going on inside religious institutions, churches, synagogues, mosques, and so on, and children would be growing up with that, of going to funerals and weddings and confirmations and bar mitzvahs and so on. These are sort of the way in which religion has dealt with it as part of the cycle of life. But for a more secular society, somehow or other, we've created a situation in which it's best tidied away. So it's the idea that it's sort of pushed to the margins, which again is very odd, because it is who we are. I guess children who live in the country get a bit more of a sense of the sort of life cycle of animals. And obviously, if you have pets, you do. And I don't mean to minimize that in any way at all. It's very important when you see and live with children and pets die, and that you realize this lovely creature that you were attached to for 5, 10, maybe even 15, 20 years as you grow older, that is, and we're part of that. It's not as if somehow or other, a pet is over there and they're just animals, that we're animals as well. So we're experiencing the same thing. So it is strange and a bit perverse if we try and tidy away these things. I've heard very moving stories from people who weren't allowed to go to, say, their father's funeral because they were a child, and spent the rest of their lives imagining all sorts of weird and terrible things about this, the father or mother. I just said father because that was a story I heard. And you think, well, what an awful thing. No matter how sad and heavy those moments are, if they are fully, I've sometimes used the phrase, a good funeral. We had a good funeral for Eddie. And I always feel very good about it, that it was a good funeral, and that we sang things and we played things and there were jokes and people told stories. And I think about that. that it was a good funeral. I feel good about it. But the idea that there would be no funeral or a bad funeral, or you wondered what they talked about and you wouldn't know, that it just makes death into this terribly frightening, distant thing that isn't part of, the inevitable life cycle. And that just makes things scary as opposed to difficult. Difficult is okay. Scary, not so.
Well, I 100% agree. And I think children people often don't let children go to funerals because they want to protect them. But children experience this usually as exclusion and often feel regret at not being part of that community, part of that moment. And we have to think about not just, suffering, because children who lose parents or siblings are going to suffer, they're going to grieve, they're going to be sad, but they also want to feel being part of the family, the community, the story, and to have moments that are meaningful. And I think the funeral is a meaningful moment. So yeah, no, I completely agree. Jess, can I turn to you for a minute? We've spoken before about the pain you experienced with the death of your dad when you were 16. And you said before how you felt that grief education could have helped you in your experiences going back to school. I wonder if you could just share a little bit about your story and that experience.
Absolutely. So I lost my dad. My dad died on the morning of my first GCSE exam when I was 16. And my dad was a head teacher. So education was kind of very ingrained in me. It was very important to him and my mum, and it was very important to me. But I was kind of thrown back into the system that kind of wasn't designed to talk about these subjects immediately. And so I had 2 years at sixth form that were really, really difficult because essentially none of us had the tools to start this dialogue and touch on this big scary subject, as Michael was saying, because none of us had the language to talk about grief, and we didn't know how to talk about death. And you'd be in the canteen having a panini and I didn't know how to bring it up. And it wasn't just the case of I miss my dad, I didn't know how to continue. I was with him when he died. And those kind of experiences stay with you, and it's hard to go back to what was normal life when nothing feels normal anymore. So it was a very interesting kind of contrast, because I felt much older than my peers at that time, because I kind of understood something that they didn't at that point. And several of us throughout those years did, and people could relate, and they'd lost siblings or they'd lost parents. But I felt like there was something wrong with me because I couldn't get out of bed and I couldn't go to school and I couldn't engage with people in the way I used to, in the way that I could see other people that were grieving, being able to go out and do all these things that were meant to be exciting and be with your friends. And it was just like I was in like a big grey cloud and I couldn't see the way out, and I didn't know what was wrong with me. And I assumed that it was me, because my only reference point for grief was kind of pop culture. So it was kind of in movies, and people just get over it. And there's this image that there's this kind of timeline with grief, and eventually you feel well enough and it just kind of passes. And I kind of had such a strong connection with my dad that I never even imagined that would be a possibility. But it didn't occur to me until much later, when I kind of had therapy and kind of been diagnosed with depression and understood that this was something happening to me, that actually grief is something that stays with you, and you make room for it, and you make room for all these new feelings, and you forge a new kind of identity where you coexist with the pain and you coexist with the memory of that person, and try and move forward and heal yourself and kind of rebuild this new normal where you kind of exist now. And it was just really difficult, because even throughout my education, and obviously my education was very tied in with this period of my life, because I went to uni after sixth form. So I had kind of 5 years of the anniversary every year, which of his death would fall on an exam. So everything was kind of combined, and it was very, it was kind of very interlinked for a lot of my life. And it was just a difficult environment to be in, because there was an understanding with people that were much older, maybe even my friends' parents who had lost their parents or had lost people. We could have a dialogue about grief. We could understand it. They would understand that I want to talk about my dad, that even if he's not here, I still have a joke to tell you from like 10 years ago that's very relevant to this point in time. And they would make space for that, and it would be normal, rather than something that kind of everyone is afraid to bring up because they don't know how you're going to react. But when there's that understanding with someone that has grieved as well, then and is or has been through that kind of process, then you can kind of have that dialogue, because you understand on a kind of basic level what that feels like. And if that had been kind of introduced when I was at sixth form, or when I was kind of even in GCSEs, and we'd had a discussion about death and grief and the kind of things that you can say. And I think people are so afraid of saying the wrong thing that they don't say anything. And it can also be really kind of confusing and unsettling when people do mention it as well, because most people won't. And then when it does come up, so for instance, I was in a psychology class and there was a discussion, we were talking about grief, we were talking about how grief and death affects the brain, and all of these kind of experiences shape your kind of neuro pathways and things like that, and your responses. And my teacher said to me, said to the class, that while everyone here probably won't experience the loss of a parent for many, many years, I know what that feels like, and Jess know what that feels like. And everyone kind of turned to look at me, and it was the first time I've been acknowledged that I was actually going through something quite traumatic on quite a big scale. Like, this was quite a big life event that was happening, that had just happened to me and was continuing to happen, where I was kind of grieving. And it was, the acknowledgement was overwhelming. Like, it kind of made me want to hide, but also it was very like affirming to be like, actually, this is quite a big event and I'm okay to be feeling very unsettled by it and very
I think what you describe, is so, I hear this story a lot about people who, because there isn't a discussion about grief generally happening all the time in schools, that people feel very isolated, that when they are hit by these sort of tidal waves of emotion, different emotions, they feel like they're sort of completely shocked by it. And I think in some ways, grief education, just even going through what some of the physical and emotional experiences are like, could help to normalize it. And also then it gives people the vocabulary for what's happening to them. Tracey, I wonder if I could turn to you and ask you from your perspective to say a little bit about grief education and, why would it be beneficial to do this?
Yeah, thank you. And I think Michael and Jess have both expressed really eloquently and articulated that feeling of isolation, that feeling that you are the only person who's going through that. And that's societally, we can make people feel very isolated in their grief. Generally, because people don't find it easy to know what to say. And as Jess said, they then therefore don't want to say anything at all. And the education, the training that we've done with lots of education professionals, they have this fear that they're going to say the wrong thing, and they worry that they're going to say the wrong thing, which means they say nothing. And as you said, that's what bereaved young people tell us at Child Bereavement UK, that they tell us all the time, that that's the worst thing that people can do, really, that lack of acknowledgement. And then you experience something where they acknowledge it, but sort of on a sort of making you stand out and feel really, exceptional, which is probably much more sensitive to have maybe spoken to you beforehand about what was coming up and that it was going to mention grief, and maybe you could process that in your own time first to give you a bit of a heads up. But again, it's because we don't have that confidence, really. And as Michael said, it's part of life. And I think being able to talk about it, to normalise some of those feelings, not trivialise it, but normalise it, helping young people to understand you can never prepare somebody for what it feels like. But to give them some sort of reference, because nobody talks about it. There is no reference point. Jess was 16 and had nothing like it in your life to refer to. Perhaps if you had some kind of education prior to that, you may have felt a little bit more able to, okay, I can understand, of course this is, of course I've got the right to. That permission that we often take away from children and young people, the permission that they need to grieve, is really important, because actually the actions that we take, we try and distract them, we try and give them little things to do, we try and talk about other things. The messages that we give them, it's not okay to, it comes from that sense of wanting to protect them from this, but actually they create, as Michael was saying, their own narratives, which are often much more frightening than reality. Very often, if we start talking, we start with, as we said, using a poem or a story, and we've used sad book quite a lot, but those are ways in which we can start those conversations with young people. And bereaved young people tell us that they really would like that education for their friends, so that their friends have some kind of narrative. And I think one of the quotes that sort of stands out in my mind is that, of a young person who said, we were more prepared to talk to a mate about his drug use than we were to talk to a friend when his dad died. We prepare children and young people to have those conversations, to be able to talk about all sorts of things that they might experience in life. But the one thing we're not confident to talk to them about is the one thing that they probably are going to experience. And we hope that they will be when they're older, and perhaps give them that place to talk about it. And even if you haven't experienced bereavement, maybe explore some of the fears and the worries and the concerns that you might have about death and about what that might feel like, because there's a ripple effect, isn't there? I'm sure some of Jess's friends probably felt a little bit anxious about their own, family members and starting to, but where would they go to with those concerns, and not really knowing how to. It wasn't that they didn't want to engage with conversation, probably just didn't have the vocabulary to do so.
Yes, and then the responsibility ends up being put on the sort of bereaved child to be the one to initiate the conversations. And as you say, Tracey, the research has shown that children, if a death is not acknowledged, that can make them feel very isolated and alone. And so we do need to give people the tools and the confidence to welcome children back into school when a bereavement happens, but also to have a language and a vocabulary, because, also when you dig a little bit, most people have had bereavements or losses of different kinds. So it becomes a point of connection, I think.
Absolutely. And I think those conversations then can happen and will happen more naturally. I was in a school just a few weeks ago, and we were asking the pupils there about their experience of bereavement, and interestingly how they were, oh, I didn't realize that your grandma had died. Oh, when did that happen? But they hadn't, it was because we were there to sort of, as a catalyst, that started those conversations. Because if no one's ever talking about death and grief, then there isn't that opportunity for young people to say that they have, as you say, many of them have experienced bereavements, too many, by the time that they sort of reach the end of their education.
Yeah, we've had some. Michael, yeah.
I was just going to say that, of course, by the time we get into adulthood and later adulthood, and our parents, as we're adults and our parents die, that we respond to that quite a lot of the time as children, because when our parents die, so my mum died actually when I was 30, my dad when I was nearer to 60, I think, but we collapse back into some aspect to some of it at any rate, because we remember things from our childhood. So as adults who've experienced the death of our parents, we do actually have a bond with children who've experienced the death of a parent, because we do partly respond as kids. We go, oh yeah, that time that I used to go to the park with my dad, and we scored a goal, or whatever I might be saying about my dad, or my mum talking about knitting me a jumper. I'm being very sexist here, but anyway, it's just part of my life. And but that's no different from maybe the kinds of no different in kind, I mean, from the kinds of things that children might feel and say. So those stories are all terribly valid, how as adults we feel about the death of what would be for the child a grandparent, because we're responding as children to these older parents.
Absolutely.
Obvious, and I think we can leave it outside the end.
I think there's a sort of wider thing with this, is going on a slight tangent, but with grief education and death, which is just also teaching about compassion and empathy and kindness, that actually, talking children through some of the feelings and how to support people and being sensitive. And, in some ways, this is a helpful approach. It's sort of tools of life that you take with you when you have other sensitive topics. Don't be terrified. Don't simply say nothing. Speak carefully, ask questions, ask the person what they would like to do. But again, I think introducing grief education would have a bigger benefit than just, these topics. I've had a couple questions come in. I want to have other things I want to say first, but some quick ones. Michael, Marcia wants to know the name of the poem that you started the conversation with.
It's in this book, which I think has now got another cover. It's called Quick, Let's Get Out of Here. And the poem is called, as I remember it, there it is, Going Through the Old Photos. There we are.
Very
and
nice.
It's told in a very direct way, with me talking as a child. It begins, me, my dad and my brother, we were looking through the old photos. So you can see that it goes like that and it finishes. What I've never figured out was whether her silence was because she was more upset about it than my dad or less. So I leave a kind of question at the end.
And it's a really good poem because it also opens up into different styles of grief, different ways of coping, sort of introducing the idea that different people grieve different ways and respond, uniquely.
And I think that's a really important thing that probably does need to be communicated to everybody, that grief is different for everybody and there is no right way to do it. And so there's people then, the problem, because it's not spoken about, that people often put judgment, I should be doing this, or I shouldn't, or you should be better by now, rather than accepting that everybody, as Jess was saying, everyone is going to deal with it in their own way, and that relationship that they had with that person is unique. So it's understandable that it would be different.
Absolutely.
I did another poem called Don't Tell Me I Mourn, I Don't Mourn, anyway, I forgot how it begins. Don't tell me I mourn too much or something. I think it's up online. You'll be able to find it, but it's about people telling. I had a sense when Eddie died that there were people sort of observing and commenting. I think that's what it was a reaction to. But anyway, it begins something like, don't tell me I mourn too much. You can find that online as well. Feel free to use it.
Absolutely, thank you. We have another question from Dorothy, which I was going to wait till the end, but this seems to me something to bring in right now, because she writes, do you think bereavement education in schools is sufficient? Should we be making death a part of life as part of primary and secondary PSHE reproduction education? I think I would just respond that I think we definitely think it is not sufficient. We have, if you look at our longer article on this, and there's a section which details what the provision for education and grief and death is in all 4 parts of the UK. And what we show is that it's not sort of statutory or mandatory in any part. So I think it does need for it to be taught. And there's also been studies that show when things aren't mandatory, even if something's mentioned as recommended, often they don't get taught. So I think they do need to go into the RSHE. The government's indicated they're going to review that this calendar year. So I think this is the time to make noise to try to push for it. And I think after COVID, it is an amazing opportunity to think about these topics afresh and to really make a change that's going to be positive for that younger generation, and they'll carry that knowledge with them as they move forward.
Yeah, and I think it's that gradual. It doesn't have to. It's about that sort of gradual build-up of knowledge as children get older. Their understanding of death develops, and death and grief develops. So actually, really important that they have that opportunity, sort of throughout. That it's a sort of the built in really, and it expands through all of their, as you said, the emotional, literacy, their ability to understand other things, overcome other losses, to become more resilient. It has far-reaching implications, I think.
Yeah, I like the idea that comes up a lot. I think PSHE mentions it, the spiral structure for education, where you pick up a topic and then you keep picking it up as you grow and it sort of develops. Tracey, what about the kind of obstacles, the opposition to introducing grief education? What are they? How can we overcome them?
Okay, so I think confidence for teachers, and we know that it's not bereavement isn't sort of something that is taught across the throughout the initial teacher training. We've done some work with student teachers to help at the early stage of their career, to help them, to give them those tools, because there's, you know, every sense that they will. 1 in 29, as you say, a child in every average classroom who's experienced a significant bereavement, and many more will have experienced the death of other people. So actually giving them the confidence. So confidence is something that we know. They worry that they're going to say the wrong thing. They don't feel equipped to do it. Actually, they have got all of the skills to do it. It's just that confidence to be able to tackle, you know, a really emotive topic, and to recognise in ourselves as well when we might experience emotion, and leading on from that, it's worries about emotional reactions of themselves, other staff members, or pupils. And again, it's normalising those reactions that actually so often children, young people don't get to see adults experience an emotional reaction. And when it does happen, if you give them some reassurance and you let them know, and you model, actually, this is what happens when that's made me feel really, really upset, and that modelling, which can really help. So sort of giving them the confidence, and that's quite freeing, because it's exhausting to try and suppress an emotional reaction constantly. Worries about parents and carers, and what the opposition might be. And I think it's really important to recognise that when we talk about parents and carers, actually it's about helping them to understand how to have open and honest conversations with their children. So informing them, letting them know ahead of time, giving them some information to help them answer these questions that children might have, so that actually by doing that we can sort of create a society where we're not afraid to talk about death and grief, where it is more open and children have access to the truth, and then they can make sense of things in sort of age appropriate language. Sometimes there's anxiety around beliefs, and of course it's about respecting that there are many different beliefs when it comes to death, but actually the understanding about grief and the universality of grief, and their beliefs overlay those things about what happens, the biological explanation of somebody dying, which often children, it kind of gets missed out. That person was alive and now they're a star, or they've gone to heaven, or whatever those beliefs might be. But to help them make sense of their beliefs and explore them with them, and understanding and recognizing that there are different people believe different things. And I think sort of the final thing is sometimes around resources and how to actually introduce that. Where do you sort of start with introducing the topic? And we do have lots of there are resources out there which are very good. Obviously, we've talked about some books and poems which are brilliant, and we've got some resources as well on our website that are free to access for teachers as well.
I think that's brilliant. I think one of the barriers too is probably money, the worry about the cost of rolling this out. I think the one thing that we've shown in our article is, in the supplementary file, the amount of resources that already exist, the teacher training programs, just an amazing set of materials out there freely available. And I think we've done this for relationship, sex education. And I think a similar approach can be made with death and grief. And I think sometimes people are anxious because they think that the children are going to be asked to talk about their experiences, rather than, again, this approach like the poem, like Michael Rosen's poems, and like other stories, and that you distance the learning and you bring children into a different kind of topic that feels safer.
Absolutely. And I think I would have to say that we wouldn't expect, when we're teaching about some of those other sensitive topics, that we wouldn't expect young people to share their experiences. So likewise, we wouldn't.
Exactly. And you send letters, you give them warning. Michael, you were going to come in.
Well, just to say that the thing about a poem or a story, to think of, the tragedy, think of Romeo and Juliet, or think of anything, think of a film or a song, is that it's quite interesting to just pause for a moment and think what it does when you watch it as a grieving person. So let's say there is a death in a film or a song, it's a lament, or it's a poem or something like that, there's somewhere or another in which the poem or the song or the play speaks for you. It's very difficult to describe, or as if it holds you, so that as you're watching it, you feel that somehow or other it's speaking for you, holding you, containing you. You are in some sort of vessel along with it. All sorts of sort of metaphors you could think of, but that you're able to somehow or other express your grief through the play, even though the play is not talking for you, or the song or the poem, whatever it is. You just feel a kind of kinship in that moment. And I think that's probably, I mean, if we want to get philosophical about it, it's why we why the human race invented literature. We invented it in order to say, this sort of stuff happened to me, maybe this sort of stuff happens to you, and then you're in it and you watch it and you go, yes. So it may be high tragedy like Romeo and Juliet, but you know, the sort of disaster that happens at the end of that these two people are not going to be able to be together, is a fundamental truth about life and death. And you experience this awfulness at this sort of end, and you just think, oh, for goodness sake, why couldn't they have not done this or done that? And it might be just the same feeling that you have, because, as in my case, my mum died of cancer. Why did she smoke? You know, I sometimes sit there and get angry. Well, she smoked because she was a child of her generation. That's what they did. She loved having a fag on, you know. But there's sort of the feelings I might have watching Romeo and Juliet might actually be containing my feelings about, you know, being sort of desperate that my mum smoked so much. Do you see? So that's how these things work, in very odd tangential ways. So if we're talking about education, in a way, there's space for these kinds of things where almost like we're not talking about grief education, we're talking about Romeo and Juliet, but that may contain us.
Absolutely. And there's so many different places actually that death and grief can come in. I mean, stories, I'm a literature person, so that's one of my favorite, but also, you know, kids learn about the life cycle, they learn about biology, they learn about sort of death that way. You do history, and, you know, what are the death beliefs and burial practice, cultural, what are the cultural different ways that people express grief? And they can all provide a way into thinking about these subjects. I think stories are particularly powerful in the way you say, Michael, because it allows us to stand inside and outside of an experience at the same time. It's both us and it's not us. And I think it's that very interesting space that stories open up for us that make them powerful. And I think you've also, in your book, Getting Better, I love the way that sometimes you say you find an image, or you see an image, or you hear a poem, and actually that gives you the language for an experience you had. It almost allows you, you know, it kind of articulates it for you. So, yeah.
I think that's
Absolutely.
really true. Yeah.
That happened for me, that I couldn't write about Eddie, and then I read the Raymond Carver poem on being locked out, which is not about somebody who's died, except he's imagining himself dying. So I've now spoiled the poem for you. Sorry about that. But it's an incredibly wonderful, dry, elliptical poem. And me and my wife, Emma, we were reading it, and it just suddenly, it sort of opened a door. It gave me the possibility to articulate what I was going through, thanks to the way in which Raymond Carver wrote. I keep playing over and over again Tom Thumb Blues by Bob Dylan, because it's articulating something about it. The opening line is, when you're lost in the rain in Juarez and it's Easter time too. And I keep saying this because there's something about it expressing the sense of being lost. And it's obviously just there in the verse, but you can hang on to these lines and phrases and then make them so that they can work for you. That's what I'm trying to say.
Well, and sometimes they come back to you just when you need them. You know, when my son was born very early, he was in a critical condition, and everyone kept telling me how brave I was. And the words from Agamemnon, Cassandra says, only the unfortunate hear such praise. And before she walks, you know, to her death, and those words kept coming back to me in this kind of ironic way. So sometimes these things come back to you when you need them, strangely. Jess, you also found superhero stories. We talked about this before, when you were kind of, young and not really understanding what was happening to you, they gave you a way into your grief as well. Do you have any thoughts about stories in your own life?
Yeah, so I think it was like completely agree with Michael, and essentially stories and writing was my way into opening the dialogue about grief. So I would come home and blog. I couldn't speak to people at school about it, but I could come home and I could write about it and write it down, and it made sense, and then I could share it and other people could read it, but I couldn't start that dialogue. Whereas when I watched a movie, and in particularly kind of like science fiction, fantasy, Marvel, a lot of like death was always on the cards, death was always on the brink, and people were always at risk of dying, so it was always in the conversation. And these were kind of stories where I would start to feel seen, because actually people would express their rage, all of these things that I was kind of suppressing and holding in, and I kind of thought there was something wrong with me for having so much anger. People were expressing and then kind of externalizing on screen in kind of a way that I could never express it myself. So it was kind of that acknowledgement of actually this is normal, and you can kind of learn stuff about yourself and kind of put together that picture of grief that I didn't really have before, that actually all of these elements kind of interlink and they are valid, and it kind of showed you different versions of grief as well, and I think just different versions of kind of people connecting through different things. So again, you can read a poem, you can read a book, and you can have a completely different experience to your friend because you've experienced something completely different to them. So I would watch a TV show, I watched WandaVision, and I would sob my heart out every single week because it's an exploration of grief and kind of moving through the different stages and confronting your life without them and the future you have to move forward to, and how the world is dragging you into that new normal that you really don't want to be in. So kind of shows like that really helped me understand myself, and they kind of form a kind of therapy alongside other traditional forms of therapy, but kind of to be seen and acknowledged and bring you out of that isolation, that feeling that actually you're not alone. And it introduces that self-compassion as well, to be like, actually these feelings are valid, they're normal, and instead of resisting them, you should lean into them and let them flow.
And I think WandaVision's great for being a very angry, furious griever, again, kind of emotions that aren't always typically depicted in
and
grief.
from a woman
sort of
as well.
Bringing those back in again.
Yeah.
I'm conscious we have 15 minutes and we have a lot of questions that have come in. I want to just highlight one that came in and was responded to by another person in the chat. One person asked if a child doesn't want to go to a funeral, should you kind of get them to? Should you encourage them? And Liz has answered, I think it's a really good answer, so I just want to read it. Tell them what will happen. Let them visit the places involved. Give them a choice and make sure an adult they trust can leave the funeral with them if they want to. And I thought that was just a really brilliant answers. We're not going to do all of these, and there's been 200 and something chat messages, but we're going to do the ones we can. So we have a question about, in an ideal where bereavement training was mandatory, would you allow parents to opt out their children?
I think you'd have to, it would have to probably be that, as in a similar vein to the sex and relationship education, where they have the opportunity to opt out, they can see the materials, and I think we'd always recommend that you give a heads up to any pupils in the class who've been bereaved, so that they have the option as well to go into that that space or not, because it might be too raw, it might be too difficult at that stage for them, but it might be really beneficial for their peer group to be in that space rather than them. So I think it would have to, I think personally, I think it would have to be something that parents could opt out of.
Yeah,
but
I think
again, it's about educating and recognizing how it's going to be taught, so that the materials can be seen by parents ahead of time.
That sounds good. Yes, I think that's right. We have a question from Tanya. What has grief taught you that you feel is important to share with young people experiencing loss? So maybe Michael or Jess on that one.
Yes, you want to kick off on that, because particularly you were young when it happened for you.
Yeah, I think when you're a child, you feel like you kind of know everything. You're the oldest you've been at that age, and you feel like you know everything there is to know. And I think grief teaches you that that there is so much more to learn. And a lot of life is being compassionate to others and also to yourself. And I think grief teaches you that there are always going to be unexpected things that happen in your life, and you just have to make the most of every day and the people that you have and the people that you love, and yeah, try and figure out a way through the difficult times, because there's always something to keep living for and people to keep going for.
And maybe too, if you have the confidence to ask for what you need, you know, that in some ways it's hard to be the one to do it. But I think if bereaved people feel strong enough to say, I need you to listen to me talk about my mum, you know, that can help them know how to support you.
Yeah, the
but
conversation.
I realize that's a big ask. I realize that's a big ask, and not everybody feels up to that.
Yeah, I think it's knowing that the relationship with the person that's died continues. So they're not here, but there's still, that relationship continues. I still do things because I think my dad would have said that's the thing to do, or I know that he would be egging me on to do it. And I think that's quite a comforting thing, and you should never try and cut that off in any way, and bring it out. And if you start that conversation and say that anecdote or say that thing that reminds you of them, then you're opening the conversation, and then people begin to normalize it, and just make space for it too. Yeah.
Good. We have a question from Professor.
Chip in on that. Sorry.
Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, just a couple of things. Exactly as you just said, Jess, is this paradox that the person dies, but is another way of looking at it that nobody dies, because you know, as long as people are alive who remember that person, then that person hasn't died. So my dad is still alive because me and my brother talk about him all the time. So in that sense, he's not died. So there's that. And then another thing, just for secondary kids, is this thing that the point is, we are just an organism in this very fragile but dangerous environment, bumping up against bacteria, viruses, things that are too much this or not enough of this, hot, cold, you know, with machines and so on. And the idea that a human being is somehow invulnerable to this stuff is an illusion that is partly put over by sort of, you know, all these sort of good health things that come at us. But the point is, we are very vulnerable people, and we go through life. And the point is, I have to say with Eddie, you know, okay, in the end, he couldn't cope with that particular bacterium called meningitis. That's what got him. Whereas I just have to come to terms with that feature of our existence on this planet. It sounds incredibly general, but certainly for secondary kids, it's a crucial aspect that, you know, if you cross the road and a bus hits you, you know, that's the terrible thing about these machines, that, you know, we are vulnerable to them, or whatever. Any of these things back then, obviously COVID taught us that as well, that here's this seemingly invisible thing, and we're vulnerable to it. It penetrates our membranes and makes, so there's that, I think. So it's probably too difficult for primary kids to fully get hold of, but even so, for secondary kids, yes.
No, really good point. Okay, we have a question from Professor Sir Al Ainsley-Green, who's the patron of Childhood Bereavement Network and former First Children's Commissioner for England, and also, I believe, the author of The British Betrayal of Childhood, a book that was widely regarded, highly regarded. So he asks, children and young people who watch a parent developing young onset dementia are often overlooked. They suffer anticipatory grief for months or years, followed by ultimate grief on death. Should schools be more aware of these pupils, and what could be done to support them? Tracey, maybe for you.
Wow. Well, anyone who's sat alongside or lived alongside someone with dementia knows how terribly difficult that can be, and anyone with a degenerative disease at all. I think it's about schools knowing what's going on. So it does rely on families letting schools know that something, and that's not always the case, but assuming that they do. It's about creating a safe space for that pupils to have that stability, normality, routine that might be really absent at home, for them to know what's happening, for for that pupil to be told and to be, depending on their age, of course, but, you know, in age appropriate, stage appropriate language, so that they understand as much as they are able to understand. That they're given that chance to have a relationship. It's still that relationship. It changes. The dynamics might change because that person's perception of the world is changing, but actually to still maintain a relationship with that person, and schools can do a lot to kind of help them to make sure that that's happening, I would say. And then I think it's about acknowledging anticipatory grief, which can be really difficult. And of course, it depends on how that pupil has been, you know, what's been explained, and you know, but it's a loss of the expected future, isn't it, of what you thought that person was going to be capable of, what they could do, and the acknowledging their feelings and giving them permission and a space. It might be school can create that safe space where they can actually be themselves and have fun and be with their friends and things, but also certain times maybe that they want to have some quiet time and reflect or get angry. And we talked a little bit about those emotions, but I'm thinking, as all grief, you know, those emotions, we often traditionally think of grief being sadness, but we know it's so many other things as well, and anger, as Jess explained, but being able to vent that anger, you know, not hurting themselves or anyone else or other people, but if there is something that they can punch or go and shout outside or run and you know, do something active to vent that anger, and understand some of the other difficult emotions, that are sort of guilt and things like that, and reassurance can play a lot, and those are the same kind of things we would talk about with managing grief and managing any kind of where there is a sort of a loss of expected future.
Yeah. Thank you. That's, yeah, I think that's really, really good. We've had a question from Claire, who says, my son is a twinless twin. His identical brother died at 5 days old, and I worry he'll be seen as an only child at school, particularly given there are more twins nowadays. Do the panels know of any resources dealing with this situation? And I think I can answer this one, which is to look at Twins Trust Bereavement Service. So I've been working with them on another project with Sharon Dark, who's the Senior Bereavement Support Officer. And they have an amazing set of resources, booklets, opportunities to connect with other parents through befriending. And I think we can probably put that on the chat somewhere, but it's Twins Trust. And I think that would be a good place to start, just thinking about kind of ways into how to talk about this. Also, in a kind of related part of the article, it was brought up, I think it was through a Scottish study, that sometimes in language teaching, where English is someone's not first language, they learn about how to talk about their family, but aren't taught the words for death. So again, it's like giving people the language so they can kind of know how to talk about their family, you know, and have answers.
And sometimes those seemingly innocuous questions can be really, really difficult, you know, for children and people to answer, you know, and often it's those sorts of things, being aware and having sort of that bereavement awareness when working and when teaching with children, that they obviously, we know that there are many different families, but actually, like, as you said, if there's not the language, they haven't got the words, it's really difficult for them to know. And sometimes they don't know whether to put someone who's died on a family picture, for example.
Yeah. We have the question, please, would you talk about children bereaved by suicide, by death by suicide?
Again, it's really difficult. With suicide, there's always a sudden death, so it makes it really, really difficult. And there's those sort of questions, you know, why did they do it, and what could I have done to prevent it? So huge amounts of guilt, and guilt's a common emotion with grieving in any case. We've got, again, there's lots of organisations out there, we've got lots of resources on our website to help for professionals and for families to help them to talk to children and young people about suicide. And again, it's being as honest as we can, and families to have those conversations with that, so that builds those bonds of trust. Often children don't, if they don't find out about what's happened until afterwards, and it's important that they hear it from their sort of a trusted adult in sort of age appropriate language. So it's about that, it's about making sure, and schools I think can play a part in that. They can maybe help a family, because obviously a family might not know, again, it comes from that sense of wanting to protect children and young people, but it's important that they have access to the truth where, from their trusted members. And again, things like a helpline where the practitioners could talk them through how to have those conversations, or school could provide a sort of neutral space even that conversation could happen.
We're almost out of time. Michael, there was a question that came up about some of your poems. People know your sad book. You pointed us to a poem today. Is there anywhere that you bring together some of your works that could act as this springboard into different conversations? Is there?
It's funny, I was thinking that as we were going along, that I could bring together some of these poems that I've written. I did a little book that is out of print now called Carrying the Elephant, which was a book of poems after Eddie died. Some of those are in a Penguin called Selected Poems that is still in print. I was just thinking about memorializing the fact that that's been terribly important for us in relation to Eddie. Ironically, that my parents didn't memorialize the son that they lost, but we, all of us, that's to say us in the family, but also Eddie's wider friends, have done a lot about memorializing. And so I suddenly thought I could do something where I brought together the various funny ways as well as the serious ways that we've memorialized Eddie, but also the relatives that we lost in the Holocaust in the family, and all sorts of wonderful things that have gone on in France, and a park being named after one of them and so on, and how these different patterns of memorializing have become very important. So triggered partly by today's conversation, well, in fact, mostly by today's conversation, I'm thinking, I could do something there. So thank you for that comment. And also,
well, I think it would be an amazing resource that we could, as part of this wider movement of trying to get death and grief and loss onto the curriculum in a mandatory way. We have all these wonderful resources, but I think a lovely collection from you, Michael, would be the perfect addition to help us.
And it would include the practical jokes that Eddie used to play on his brothers, one of which was he kidded his younger brother that he was eating cat food when in fact he was eating pate. But it's a lovely story, and his younger brother always quotes it and says, that time that Eddie, and I really believed he was eating cat food and he was just eating pate. He switched it over and went, "Oh, this cat food's brilliant," like this, and he believed it. So that would be in it as well, alongside the other stuff. So there you go.
I think that would be amazing. It's been impossible to keep up with the incredible amount of chat. I've seen quite a lot of names of people I know. I've seen a lot of charities whose work I admire, people who teach in schools, people who work with children, SEN workers, people who've experienced bereavement. I'm going to have to go through the chat at a later date, because I think it has a lot of wonderful resources and things for us to think about. Please, it's been a really fantastic conversation. John Adams, who is one of the writers of the policy report, he started a petition to introduce mandatory grief and death education. He's going to be speaking to Parliament, I think, in September or something like that. And I think we all need to reach out to anyone who has contacts with the right people and make noise to try to see if this is the year we can make this change. And I do think it's not just about death and grief, but it's about how we care for one another, how we speak to one another, and creating just a more loving, compassionate, kind world, because we're all going to die and we're all going to be bereaved, and we want to be able to support other people and be supported ourselves when it's our turn. Any final thoughts before we say goodbye? Anybody?
If you get there before I do, just dig a little hole and pull me through. I'd dig a little hole and pull me through. Oh, dear.
I'll do that.
Nice.
Thank you so much to our panel. It's been a really rich, wonderful conversation. Those of you
I
out
was
there,
just going to say, one of the things that we have found is that actually opening up and having these difficult conversations in schools can build real bonds of trust between those people who have those conversations and the pupils. And so, you know, it has far-reaching benefits. Not only that, but actually a whole cohort of peer group support for those bereaved pupils in school. So I think there's a real positive that come out of that.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you to our audience for joining today, and thank you to our amazing guests, Jess, Tracey, Michael, and we'll see you next time on the Good Grief Festival panel. Goodbye for now.
Bye-bye.